I came to writing very spontaneously, and I'm passionate about it. And my whole professional life, and even my whole life, is somehow connected with reading and later writing. And probably it has a lot to do with my family history. I come from a small country. I was born in Czechoslovakia. That country, more than 20 years ago, separated into two countries, Czech and Slovak Republic. I live in the city of Bratislava, which is the capital of the Slovak part. And it's a city on borders, city bordering with Hungary and Austria. And it's a city which is located on the river Danube, and was always a place where the history was happening. It's a place contaminated with history, and it's a location which was always dividing worlds between East and West, South and North, Germanic and Slavic worlds. And for me, part of my family heritage was the bookshelves, the book collections, the tradition of writing, because my grandfather and my father were also writing nonfiction, both coming from the academic field. My grandfather was professor of economics, my father professor of computer science and mathematics. And this intellectual heritage I got as a child is something extremely valuable for me, and I appreciate that I had this chance, because it's not common. It's not the usual thing anymore. And I come from a family where people taught a lot. My grandmother and my mother were teachers of deaf children, and my wife is doing the same thing. So I was born there in Bratislava, in the heart of Europe. I traveled a lot when I finally could, when the world became open and the Iron Curtain fell down and we could travel. So I had the chance to visit Europe, to visit the United States, to spend months abroad. But I love to be back home always again, and I find it very inspiring to live there and to live in this between worlds and between places. And so I do writing. I translate, especially from the German language into the small Slovak language, spoken only by some 4.5 million people. And I also work, I'm a director of a library in the Goethe Institute in Bratislava, which is the only German library we have in the city. And so it's connected with books, and it's a beautiful way of life.
Yes, I can see that. So many things. Can you tell me something about your first encounters, or the important early encounters with German language and culture?
Well, when I mentioned I'm coming from a small country, and when you look at the map of Europe, and even when you look at the map of the Middle Europe, you will notice that it's full of very small nations, many different languages, and many minorities. And even the small Slovakia has Hungarians, have Ruthenians, had a German-speaking community. And that's part of my family history, because our grandfather from mother's side was called Stefan Kirchmeier, and he was coming from a small town called, in Slovak, Levoča, in German Leuchau, in Hungarian Leuce, and he was member of a minority of German-speaking so-called Zipsa Deutschen, Zipsa Germans, Zips being the name of a region. In Slovak we call it Spiš. It's a beautiful landscape close to High Tatra mountains. It's a mountain area where during the many centuries Germans were running the cities. Germans had the city culture there, and it was part of the Hungarian Empire, and it was very multilingual society and multi-religious society. And so in this way my grandfather was still speaking both languages, as many people do in the US as well, and he spoke actually such a little bit strange German, because these people in Zips lived in a very closed world, far from Germany. Even not many Germans know that these sort of minorities exist in the east of Europe. And so I think this is something very precious, because in the global world, many people are asking, well, why do we need all these small languages when we have English? But that's why I think we need the translations, because translation, as Umberto Eco put it, is the only common language of Europe. And I think the language is something extremely valuable for the human culture and for humankind in general. And so I had a privilege to experience this dominance of languages in my life as a child already. And of course, language was also a question of a task of ideology in case of Russian, for example, in the part of the world where I come from, whereas I still had 3 years of Russian education, which was for everybody. Everybody had to do it, and I liked it. But shortly after Velvet Revolution, we all collectively decided to stop this because, for usual reasons, we had enough of the Soviet dominance in our life, and the language became connected with this system, which is not quite fair, but that's how people understood it at that time. So I lost parts of my Russian, but when you come from a place like me, you need to talk. You need to learn languages, otherwise you're lost in the world. I would not be able to communicate with people here in Minneapolis.
Yes. I had a conversation with a graduate student at an institute in Vienna who, at this institute, had adopted English as its language. And he said, what will happen, or what is happening in Austria, is that the universal language has become bad English. Because it goes to the transactions in the academic transactions go to the lowest level of capacity. And that's, of course, terrifying if one values what a living language can do. So how do you think about the preservation of the values of the living languages in this world you're in, where imperial languages of various sorts are overlaid, trade languages are overlaid, and then there are people who have a language of the heart, so to speak, a language with which they can do beautiful things shared with very few people. And how does that look to you?
That's a very complicated and complex issue, and it's a very important issue, I think, for the civilization as we have it, because we see that the way we communicate is changing so rapidly and so fast. And I'm not the person who would now say that just this horrible social media and like this horrible Twitter communication and the bad Facebook status and so on. Absolutely not. I'm the one who is welcoming the changes in general, and I learn myself to work with these new technologies and new ways of social communication, and I think it can have something valuable in it as well. The problem is that the way our educational system is developing in most of the countries is that we are losing the fundamentals of languages in the way that we are not able to communicate correctly together. And we can see it in all sorts of in the political correctness, in the manipulation of media, where it's much easier than in the past to confuse people. And we are listening to mixed messages everywhere. It's on a 24/7 news. The language became simply not clear, and when when we're not thinking it's something valuable, we will lose the way to understand each other, because the language can bring us closer, but when we are forgetting how to use it correctly, we are getting further from each other. And this dominance of, in German they call it Denglisch, this this sort of a mixture of bad English and broken English and bad German, but we can see it everywhere. On the other hand, I think that there are some tendencies to protect even the smaller languages and translation. I came here to University of Minnesota to give a lecture on a translation project, and I also was talking about how Europe is trying to find a way how to make translations, good translations, and promote quality in translating. And these are things which are recognized by intellectuals, are recognized by people to keep distances, to keep small languages alive and bring the correct meaning, because that's what's dangerous about broken English, that it can be fun, but it can bring a lot of hate even to communities, to nations, to the states. And this hate speech, which is spreading around the world like a virus, that's what's making me scary, because any violence always starts in the language. Once it's legitimized in the language, in the speech, then it can spread as a real thing later. And where I come from, we have a lot of experience with written propaganda and spoken propaganda for decades. And maybe I'm a little bit more sensitive to these issues. And that's why I see as one of my tasks in life to talk about language, to learn people how to edit texts, how to speak and write correctly in their native language. And why I'm so precise about the proofreading of my own texts, of the translations I do. Well, language is a very complicated issue, but it's also a sense how we transform beauty and how we are able to communicate on beauty. So that's what's most important for me.
One feature of my recent travels was my first immersion in real dialect.
Mm-hmm.
I'd met Germans who spoke dialect, or remembered that they had at some point spoken some dialect. But this was the first time I was in communities where the high language was rarely used, and sometimes as foreign, or more foreign perhaps than English. And that gave me ideas I hadn't had before about what musical qualities and social interaction possibilities are preserved in communities that have even a subset of Slovakian, or that become then very tiny communities, really. And you've been speaking about preserving meaning and accurate translation. Are we going to have to simply give up on preserving music?
I don't think so. That's a very interesting thing, because when the first wave of fear of globalization came in the 90s into Europe, and it was very intense, then suddenly, even as the European Union was getting bigger, there were so many people scared and panicking that we're gonna lose all these small minorities and we're gonna lose all these small regions, and it's like lost forever. And it's Well, we lost lots of small worlds. It's just like the Sipser Germans that I mentioned. They are not anymore really present in that part of the world, and they are disappearing. But on the other hand, the world is changing slower than we expected. And for example, just to drive a couple of minutes from where I live to Burgenland in Austria, you can hear just amazing German accents which you could never learn at school. And the same way when you drive from where I live in Bratislava to 4 hours drive to the east, or 5 hours you are at the Ukrainian border. And people there speak a very interesting mixture of Slovak and Russian, and these Ruthenians have a very significant own accents and language. And this is the region where Andy Warhol's family came from before leaving for Pittsburgh. And so this is something which we should enjoy. There is a rise of literature even in Austria, in Switzerland, which is written in dialects and performed in dialects. And I think these authors don't mind that they're gonna stage us in this very small community, because that's what they think is valuable. And there are lots of tendencies in music to present the local, to play music connected with the old folk traditions and so on. So in this way, I'm quite optimistic that this very variety of styles and cultures and folk traditions, this is not going to disappear that fast. Let's see. I don't know. I'm not sure, but I see an opposite direction as well.
I was so struck talking to people in Burgenland about how before the opening, their communities were dead ends. Mm-hmm. There was no decent-sized city available. And then suddenly there's a city where you could go to buy milk. It's 160,000 people, you know. At the same time, they were telling about, they'd had a pretty good business in Arabian horses across the border. They had the relationships, but once the border was open, there was no more. There were no special relationships anymore. So, but the sense that a dead end becomes part of a thoroughfare, that was really striking. I'm wondering how it hit you. How old were you, please, when the opening happened?
Well, I'm maybe the last generation which still remembers and grew up in the communist Czechoslovakia. Definitely am. I was 13 when the Velvet Revolution came, and during my 12 years under communism, this border, this barbed wire, electric fences, these stations with gunmen, this is very present in our lives. And because Bratislava is that close to the border, to the west, we could see it on a daily basis. And in the 70s and 80s, more than 300 people died trying to cross this border. And almost every family had some immigrants or people who tried to escape, and these stories were very much alive at that time. On the other hand, not even barbed wire could stop Austrian media from being transmitted to where I live. So during the whole 80s, I was growing up with Austrian television and Austrian radios. I learned about my own country more from Austrian TV station ORF than from Czechoslovak television. This was our main source of information about what's going on in the world. But on the other hand, I really thought it's gonna be a world I will never see with my own eyes. When my cousin, who was 18 at the time, emigrated from Czechoslovakia quite dramatically over the Alps from Yugoslavia to Austria, we thought we will never see him again. And that was half a year before Velvet Revolution. This was in summer 1989. And I thought, well, he's gone and probably we'll never meet. So this was the reality of the life still in the late 80s. And you made an interesting point, because we always looked at this border only from our side, and we were not really thinking how is the other side, how is the Austrian side looking at us over the fence. And this became a major issue in our relationships now, because the fences are gone and the borders are open. We are now part of so-called Schengen Treaty, which means we don't even need a passport to drive through. There is no more border controls, and just like between the American states. And thing is that, for example, in these border regions, there are now Slovak people buying houses on the Austrian side because the land is cheaper, because it was the dead zone. So suddenly there are communities with completely new inhabitants who came from across and commute to Bratislava or commute to other place. The same thing is happening in Hungary. In a way, we could talk about some sort of a new monarchy where these nations live peacefully together. But it's not only... there are some problems concerning this, and it's not that easy. There are lots of protests once in a while, and not all politicians like to misuse these issues of migration for their own purposes. And in this sense, of course, when border opened finally to Austria, that my main target became the West. I wanted to discover Austria, Germany, Belgium. I spent lots of time abroad because I simply had no idea how the life is there. Interestingly, in the last years, I'm very interested again in traveling east, discovering Belarus, Weißrussland, discovering Ukraine, or east of Romania, Bulgaria, and other places, because there are so many things in common, and there are so many things to discover. I'm very open on both sides, and that's what's so fascinating, that now we became united in many ways, but there are still so many differences and so many problems we're dealing with.
Reminds me somehow of kind of the optimism before World War One.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the possibility, the sense of a really cosmopolitan Europe, and then that of course came crashing down, and then again came crashing down. So, which was your first Western city?
Well, definitely Vienna, right after it was possible to travel there. We had absolutely no money, we couldn't afford anything, and it was just a very low-cost way of day trips. I was traveling there regularly, discovering museums, discovering art galleries, bookstores. I made some first friends, and I loved the city of Vienna, and I think this connection. We are the two closest located capital cities in Europe, Bratislava and Vienna. This is just our drive by car or by train, and the connection is really very good. And there used to be a tram, a streetcar connecting these cities before the Second World War, directly to the city center of Bratislava from Vienna. Unfortunately, this is after Cold War. They never re-established this connection. Maybe one day, but another very important city in my life is Berlin, which is for me the cultural capital of Europe in the last couple of years, and one of the most fascinating metropolis in the world today, I think, where I spent many months, thanks because my publisher used to be in Berlin before he moved to Stuttgart, and so Brussels would be another station of my life, and it's just unbelievable because I'm, after a long time, first generation which had this chance to experience being artistic contact with colleagues abroad and do some exchange of ideas, and that's, we are having good lives, much better lives as artists than our parents and grandparents used to have. They lived in a very censored, very limited society, controlled by secret police, constantly in threat. We have other sorts of threats, but we are free, and that's something of a fundamental value for me, and I never enough can express how thankful I am for this possibility that the world change and I live in a free country.
Yes. The rhetoric around change here is so heavily laden with words like climate change and energy depletion, and matters like that are kind of constant, and so it's just very interesting to find a place where change and hope are, I mean, as tightly tied as they probably were at the end of the 19th century when, Pasteur just promised that we would get rid of pretty much every infectious disease at the same time that trains promised that distance would be no problem. Since I think I want to personalize this a little bit, my two major cities in the last 6 months have been Vienna and Berlin. So I've been kind of reintroduced to them after 40 years absence. And I'm curious, perhaps with both cities, about how it was for you to visit them with those eyes, with that sense. I mean, a sense that, of course, the citizens of these cities can't have. Berlin, perhaps a little bit, because they've overcome that history. But what was it like? What emerged from, that initial, well, everything's very strange, or a lot of it's very strange. What emerged as impressions?
Well, I mentioned that place where I come from, Bratislava, is contaminated with history, but that's exactly the case with Vienna and Berlin, and these cities played a major role in what Europe was in the 20th century, and when we talk about cruel continent, as historians do in connection, or with bloodlands connected with Europe, well, then we have to talk about Vienna and Berlin as well. And in that sense, both of the cities you were mentioning have the same East-West experience, which was very dramatic and very drastic and brutal. And for decades, some in the cities tried to forget this past and try to pretend nothing happened, but it's not possible, simply. I think our generation, maybe the third generation after the war, is the one to ask really unpleasant questions, and there are so many fascinating creative discourses in these cities, and both are closely connected with artistic creativity or what we call the creative industry, where both are run by left governors, and they have heavily funding for culture and arts and humanities, which I think is great. And Vienna is an interesting example of a city which made culture to one of its most important sources of income, and made culture to something which is a business for the whole community, but it's still on a very high level. And I think we can learn a lot from that experience, because usually culture is understood as something which only costs us a lot of money and tax. our taxpayers' money, and why should we do that? And it's not for anybody. I can see it here in Minneapolis, where so many stadiums are being built, and not everybody is happy about it, that the state or the taxpayers' money goes to that. Well, Berlin and Vienna have shown the world that you can attract millions of visitors and people willing to stay because you are cultural, because you have something to offer in opera, in theater, in literature, music, and so on. And this is, of course, for someone like me, amazing opportunity to leave the small Bratislava of 500,000 people and suddenly be in a real metropolis and be part of it, go to Burgtheater in Vienna or to Staatsoper and go to Philharmonics in Berlin or to Konzerthaus am Gendarmenmarkt and go to Literaturhaus and many other places which played an important role in my life and development as an artist, as an intellectual, as a citizen, because both cities have very active civic life but are dealing with many similar problems as we are in Bratislava, in Slovak Republic.
And how were you received in these cities as an intellectual writer from Bratislava?
Well, for writers from the east of Europe, Berlin became the most important city. Not anymore London or not Paris in France. Berlin became the city of a literally interchange in Europe, because most Ukrainians, Polish, Hungarian, or whatever Serbian writers became mostly famous over German translations and Berlin. And Vienna as well is playing an important role, and I was lucky because 3 of my novels came out in German, and I have a very good publishing house there. And the last novel, which came out in German, Tod auf der Donau, in Slovak, Dunaj v Amerike, maybe in English as Danube in America, came out in 4 editions and sold surprisingly well. And so I was on a long reading tour through Germany. I read a couple of times in Berlin, a couple of times in Vienna, and I had a chance to write some texts for German magazines, German newspapers, and there is simply this unbelievable, huge audience for culture, and that's something which is so precious today, when there's so much competition for cultural events just on the screen of any television in any hotel. And so I was lucky and I was happy to be part of it and to experience how it is to see a lively literary scene, and with so many events, readings, public discussions, the level of intellectual discourse in Berlin is really fascinating, and it became a melting pot of ideas and creativity, and so I always look for an excuse to travel to Vienna or to Berlin.
One thing that struck me talking to people was the effect of quite inexpensive higher education, especially in Austria. I mean, my guide in Burgenland, who was an used auto salesman, had an advanced degree in anthropology, and had decided that it was better to pursue that privately while selling cars than to try to make it in the academic competitions. But he was clearly an anthropological eye, a very astute anthropological observer of his own. And I met a number of folks like that who had pursued higher education because it was easy and cheap and a good way to kind of grow up, but then didn't find academic houses. Is that also the case in Slovakia? I mean, is that the case in your life that you have people, remarkably educated for the work that they do and for for their role in life.
Well, absolutely. That's a problem of whole Europe, and I'm afraid it's coming to America as well. And I was just mentioning this Danube novel, and me myself, I spent 2 years working on river cruises on the River Danube for an American travel company, and that's what my novel about is based on. It's my own experience. It's partly autobiographical, and interesting thing is that many of my colleagues on board of the ship were actually people from academics, political scientists from Hungary, sociologists from Bulgaria, people from linguistic department, linguists from Romania, and many others. And we were forced by the company not to tell to be educated. We were supposed to, play it stupid to so to say, not surprise the Americans that we are from a completely different world and we had different careers. But most of these colleagues of mine, similar as me, we couldn't finance ourselves with what we do in the first place. And we had to switch and be flexible and try to somehow pay our rents. And that was for me the way for 2 years to finance my writing. And this is the case that really lots of good brains are leaving to have a better opportunity abroad. The problem is that the way how education system works, it's not that close connected with the reality of the contemporary Europe. So in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, you have just a whole generation of young people who are not gonna find a job. And maybe no job at all, but most probably not in their profession. And that's very scary because that's a mass of people without perspectives. And Slovakia is one of the countries where in the poorer regions, in the east, in the southeast, we have serious problem with people who are totally desperate with their situation, earning 300 euros or 200 euros and just barely surviving on the limit. And so there is this new wave of emigration in Europe, people leaving even to States or elsewhere just to have a better chance.
So you mentioned it, what sounds like two things. You have the people who are really poor,
Mm-hmm.
and then you have the people who may be doing reasonably well. They can get jobs like this river thing, and or many other kinds of decent jobs, but they have no professional future that lines up with their dreams and ideals and so forth. Now, I can see pretty clearly, the dangers with the first group. But how do you see the situation of that second group? I mean, in some ways, I found, there was an aspect of it that I found sort of heartwarming. I mean, I know, I've done 20 years of interviews. I know what limitations, not formal, but real limitations the Academy puts on thinkers, both on what they can say and also on what they can investigate and what they can experience. The number of people who've labored, the number of philosophers who've labored, probably one could count them on a couple of hands. That's huge for the limits of philosophy. I mean, exaggerating. So there was a way in which the idea of intellectuals spreading to the letter carriers and the used car salesmen and the tour guides that felt like, okay, suddenly somebody will infuse energy into these areas that have been dead ends in the way Burgenland was a dead end. But again, I didn't have to live it, although I guess my own career has been something of the same matter. But I'm wondering how it was. how you see the situation of those people, having gone through it.
That's an interesting point. Well, basically, I am still from a generation which grew up knowing that the work is something valuable and you have to do something and you have to earn your living. I started to finance myself with 18, which is rather unusual in the eastern part of Europe, where many people live in 3-generation houses or even flats. And I wanted to stand on my own feet and start my own career. And I studied later than usual of my generation. And I knew I need money and I had to pay for my apartment. And I just decided, okay, I'm gonna try it on the River Danube. And that's what many people do. And I think the system we grew up learned us to be flexible, so just to do what's needed. And the problem is when it's getting massive and it's gonna be the only chance for so many clever minds we have. And then when they either find a position in Frankfurt or whatever, Marseille, then at home in Bratislava, where my brother is a good example. My brother left for Prague because he's a clever philosophy major. He did his PhD in US. There was no job for him in Slovakia. And it's a pity, I think, because in Prague he's doing very well teaching there. He could have been teaching at home and maybe made the change in his country. So in this way, when the government is not able to provide a way how to get the talented people, the clever people, an opportunity, of course they will disappear and they will go somewhere where they have some chance taking for granted. And I completely understand it, and I have nothing against it. They should go. I advise people to go, but maybe come back. I'm always happy when somebody comes back and says, I want to do something for the place where I come from. And many people were asking me, Michal, why didn't you stay in Germany? You have 3 books there, you have publisher, you have started some sort of a small career writing for papers, you could continue with this. But I said, no, I want to go back to Bratislava because this is where I come from. This is where my voice is heard, and I have so many readers there, and I really appreciate it, and I'm thankful for that. And I don't think the author should give it up. I don't want to give it up. So in this way, it's a very controversial issue, and I don't have a clear statement on this to say, well, this is the right way to do it. But I'm really scared when I see this army of unemployed young people running around the streets of European cities, frustrated with you have over 50% of young Spanish people have no perspective to get a job. And the good thing is that it's starting a really massive new migration. So in the small country of Slovakia, suddenly we have 400 Norwegians who are learning medicine in one small city called Martin. And we have 80 Icelanders learning in the city of Martin, which makes it probably the 2nd largest Icelandic city in the world. And this was unimaginable 10 years ago. Now they can come to Slovakia and start a living there because it's much cheaper to study medicine there, and the living standard is good, but it's cheap housing. So now we have hundreds of Germans who are coming to Bratislava to study medicine, Greece, people from Greek, and so on and so on. And so similar things you see in Budapest, where suddenly Western Europeans are coming because it's cheap, and the level of academic, the quality of education is still rather okay. And so this is what makes the place where I live so fascinating as well. And it's changing constantly. My life has been one constant change in education, in book market, in healthcare system. Everything's changed. Not everything for good, but there is some development, and that's probably important.
progressive people I talked to in Vienna were very fond of pointing out that the major immigration into Austria has been German immigration. And when people are talking about the foreigners coming in, it's first German foreigners. Now, has this kind of immigration has that pushed English to the top as the language of instruction, language of intellectual?
Absolutely. Well, 5 years ago, government stopped German to be the obligatory second language, which was cause for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung to put Slovakia on the title page with a very sad text like disappearance of German in Slovakia is continuing, and well, English is becoming global even in the eastern part of Europe, and of course these students coming from abroad learn in English because there are young professors who speak it fluently and teach in English, and they have to pay a little for this opportunity to learn in English, but still but I think it's great when you speak German in this part of the world where I come from, because there are so many investments from German companies, and you simply can get a better job when you know the language, and so I recommend it to everybody. I was invited to Minneapolis by University of Minnesota Institute for Advanced Studies because I'm really excited that two academics, US academics, Mark Lenshaw, professor from University of Wisconsin, and Eva Hudecová, here from University of Twin Cities, they translated my novel, Danube in America, into English. This book came out in 5 languages already, and I would be very happy if they were able to find a publisher here in the US for this book. They did an excellent job, and the translation is really good. And we did 2 presentations. I was speaking to students of Eva, and we had a lecture on the project of this translation, how it came that we got together, the 3 of us, working on this translation, and I had a really inspiring time here, meeting these both great guys, and meeting the public, meeting the students. The thing is that on the American book market, only 3% of books are translated books, which is very low number, and it's declining. When you compare it with German book market, there is 50% of books which are translated. So when I come into the bookstore in Berlin, every second book I see is translated from some other language. In the United States, it's only 3 books in 100. And even these 3 books are mostly hidden somewhere in the last bookshelf. So I do hope, and 3 of us who worked on this, we hope we're gonna find a way how to bring this book to American audience as well. And I was very thankful that I could come here and promote this work and meet people, talk to people, and we're gonna start now a process of talking to agents, talking to publishers, talking to editors, and it was a great week I could spend here, and I do hope it's gonna have a nice result in a published novel.
Well, let's end on an unabashedly commercial note. There's no reason that publishers are not watching this. Certainly publishers stay up late and watch television. So why should an American publisher be interested in your book?
Well, this novel is a novel about river cruise. It's a humorous way how to talk about my own experience. It's a narrative connected with the river Danube. It's about a young man called Martin Roy, who is originally a literary translator, living in Bratislava, growing up there, but who fails economically as a translator, and who works on ships traveling with 120 very rich American people from Regensburg in Bavaria, Germany, all the way over Vienna, Bratislava, Budapest, all the way to the Balkan Danube, to the east of Romania and to the Black Sea. And it's a book about the clash of civilization on board, because most Americans are for the first time in Europe, and he's inventing stories. He is lying to them very often. He's playing games with them, and he's very ironic about his own position, being an intellectual in this unusual position, working 24/7 without salary. The company has a no salary policy, so he's only paid by the tips from the customers. So he's extremely keen on this excellency in evaluation and in good tips, good tipping. And so it's a book, it's a parody of the mass tourism on the ships, and it's also a travel book, because while reading it you discover a lot of Danube landscapes and a lot of Danube cities and communities and parts of the history. And so it's 20 days and almost 2,000 kilometers on the river Danube. And I was lucky to get it published in Serbia, in Bulgaria, in Germany, and in Czech Republic. And now we do hope we're gonna get it published in the US as well.
So it sounds like a book of very broad appeal,
Mm-hmm.
and a very kind of good vacation. Yeah, my friends who are actually going to take probably that cruise exactly, if not that cruise exactly, something very similar. I mean, a long, long Danube cruise would be sort of perfect for them. Is there anything serious about this book?
Yes, it is. It's a book which is not only dealing with the trip itself, but it's also about the beauty of literature, because the Martin is a man of books, even on board of the ship. And he is contemplating a lot about what translation means for him, what books meant for him. He wanted to be a man of letters, and he's still dreaming about coming back to this job. And there is also a sort of a romance, a sort of a love story with a girl he met as a young boy in Bratislava, and who is somehow meeting again after many years on board of the ship. And two of them are also kids of the time between the Velvet Revolution and afterwards. It's a book which is dealing a lot with the times, and there's a lot of melancholy about it. And basically this humorous parts are dealing with the way how this American company, in a book called American Danube Cruises, how they are dealing with the crew on board, and with Martin himself as a sort of a tour guide / tour manager. I had a lot of fun writing it, and I was lucky because it got sold. It was selling quite well, and I was quite scared when I started to write it that there are so many Danube novels, but there are not. I was quite surprised, probably because of this border separating East from West. There are some essays and some parts of Danube which became narratives in literature, but I was happy to discover that this is one of the first novels which are dealing with the whole river of Danube in the contemporary writing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great club to belong to, with Life on the Mississippi,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
you know, all the great river novels. titles.
Yeah.
Well, I hope it goes that goes well. Just one last question: what kind of a publisher are you looking for? I mean, you must have a publisher of some. You must have in mind a publisher of a certain size and a certain reach. What are you looking for?
Well, that's a big question. I think after Eva and Mark Lenschow spent so many years doing this, it took almost 2 years to finish the translation. I think they will be happy just to find a fair, interested guy, a literary publisher who would like to do this project with us. And we are very open for ideas, and we do hope there's going to be an interested partner who somehow loves good stories. And in this we have no limitation. We're just going to wait and see what comes out, and let's keep our fingers crossed.
So a smaller publisher
Maybe
would be acceptable.
I think so. Yeah.
Yes, a literary publisher. Well, thank you for your time.
I thank you very much for having me.